1. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for another installment of What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism. This series of webinars is held in partnership with the Holocaust Resource Center of Buffalo, Holocaust Museum LA, the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, Echoes and Reflections, and the Ninth Candle. Thank you to all our partners for their continuing support of this program. My name is Haley Wells, and I am the program manager at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. Before we begin, I would like to go over a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute for the duration of the program. Today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation comes at a crucial moment in our history when the lessons of the past are desperately needed to combat contemporary iterations of hate, division, and extremism. Our discussion about German Expressionist artists in the Nazi regime will be presented by Lauren Crampton from the Holocaust Education Resource Council. Lauren grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, and studied Greek and Latin languages and art history at the University of Florida in Gainesville. She attended graduate school in classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. After living and working in Philadelphia for more than a decade, she returned to Tallahassee to teach the history of the Holocaust at HERC. Without further ado, over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Haley. Um, Today we're going to be talking about the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich, Germany, that debuted in July of 1937. But the majority of the works of art that were displayed in the show were actually from earlier in the 20th century. So I'm going to get started right around the turn of the century, right around 1900. When the forms were beginning to change in Germany, and particularly a movement called Expressionism was becoming a lot more popular with the advent of photography. Realism was not the only option for painting, and even academic painting was moving to more abstracted forms, and artists were experimenting with new media, new ways of looking at things, partially in response to the rapid industrialization, but also a lot of the globalism and the connections and the exposure they were having to artists from around the world and from other parts of Europe. So this image that is on the front page here that you see, it will be featured in the German art show, in the Degenerate Art Show, and it's one of the few artists that, or one of the few pieces that was actually produced by a German artist. So we'll get to that. It was produced a lot later than some of the works that we'll be looking at first, but it's reflective of a stylistic trend that began in the early 20th century and moves along up into the 1930s when the exhibit took place. So to back up the clock, the first image we have is an image called Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, which was painted by Vasily Kandinsky in 1903. And in many ways, it's one of the seminal pieces of expressionist German art. Even though Kandinsky was actually born in Moscow, he came to work in Germany and spent the majority of his career in Germany, and is one of the founders of a school of German expressionist artists called Der Blaue Reiter, named after this painting. Um, and it has many of the forms that are still recognizable. We can see the landscape, the rider on the horse, but forms are slightly abstracted. It's blurry. It's not quite clear where in the foreground the rider is, if he's far forward or if he's more toward the center. Um, it's flat, but at the same time, it has a sense of movement and an air of mystery, and reflects some of the trends that will become more abstracted as time goes on. At the same time, Impressionism was popular in France, and right around this time, French Expressionism emerged with the artist Henri Matisse. This is one of his famous paintings from 1905 to 1906 called The Joy of Life. And it's in a movement known as Fauvism that was popular in France at the time. And Matisse was really experimenting with color, with form, with line, with representing movement in a naturalistic way that wasn't necessarily realistic, with the exaggerated colors, the dynamism of the wavy lines, and then the figures that are represented in different sizes, in the foreground, middle ground, and background, but at the same time, the picture plane really comes to the front, and all the lines lead to the center. So we have use of diagonals, all to frame the painting, and flatten the composition. No longer completely dependent on a mathematical perspective to render space in a photorealistic manner. Um, the real art, work of art that's considered the first piece of abstraction properly is Pablo Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, which was painted in 1907. And it also uses the flattening of forms, diagonals. Um, the sense of space is really flattened to the point where the images seem to be at the front of the painting, but you can't really tell where they are in space. And then also the mask-like features, of the faces are influenced by art that's not necessarily Western, from Tahitian art. It was actually called primitive art. There was a movement toward primitivism, that was to consciously employ styles that were not necessarily European in art at this time. Um, and then these trends, are also being experimented with in Germany. This is a painting from an artist named Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who was one of the founders of the Brücke school of, Expressionism in Germany. Brücke means the bridge, and he was the founder of this group of artists, that worked together to really bridge the past and the present. They were inspired by Matisse and by Picasso, but also wanted to have a distinctly German quality to their images. So he tried to paint life, impressionistically, but also expressionistically, not necessarily painting, with photorealism, but still painting very quick, very gesturally, producing many, many images, all trying to capture the feeling and the essence of the figures being represented, and putting so much emotion into the color, into the lines, into the gestural lines, the diagonals, to capture the movement and the expression as opposed to a stagnant photorealism. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was also inspired by, the movement called primitivism that incorporated foreign, and Tahitian art specifically. This is a Southeast Asian chair. And, the girl in the foreground is recognizably a girl, but her face is also quite mask-like. There's the un um, there's the unrealistic use of color, that heightens the expression, and the emotion in it, and but isn't necessarily trying to replicate reality photographically. Also painted very impressionistically, and quickly, but still recognizable in its forms. Kirchner was specific to say that as much as he was interested in abstracting forms, he wasn't, seeking full abstraction where the forms became unrecognizable. Um, from a few years later in 1913, this is another example of a painting by Ludwig Kirchner, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And, one of the things that in the primitivist movement, that he sought was a way to time travel without leaving the country. He was, just north of Dresden when he was painting these, and he was living in a collective with other artists, and they sought, a mechanism of going back in time and connecting with other cultures, because, on the eve of World War I, there was a lot of anxiety about what was going on in Germany, um, as well as there was exposure to new cultures, and new ethnicities in Germany at this time. Um, Another work is Franz Marc. This is The Tower of the Blue Horses. This is also from 1913. He was from the other group of expressionists called Der Blaue Reiter, and he worked with Kandinsky. He painted a lot of animal forms, but also abstracted forms into basic shapes with color, line, and this flattening of images, bringing the images to the front um, of the scene to really compress space and give this flat appearance, but at the same time still have a sense of depth and dynamism in the space. Kandinsky, who worked with Franz Marc and Der Blaue Reiter group, who had previously painted the Der Blaue Reiter, by 1913 is painting fully abstracted images. So in many ways, he's the most avant-garde of the avant-garde artists in this period because it's in 1913, right on the eve of World War I, that he's painting truly abstracted forms where he's breaking down the visual field into color, shape, line, but you don't necessarily see a recognizable form of a face or anything represented photorealistically. So this is 1913, and this is a little bit of the art that is becoming very popular in Germany right before World War One. To juxtapose that, I just wanted to show this one picture very briefly. It's from 1913, and it was painted by Adolf Hitler. And it's a scene of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, and it was painted in 1913. And this was a time after he had attempted to gain access to and gain admission to um, the Vienna School of Fine Art and Painting. After the first round of exams, the first time he was rejected, he was told that his art was better suited to architecture because he was a competent technical draftsman. So then he went to apply to the School of Architecture, but he didn't have the academic qualifications for the prerequisites. So in 1908, he goes back to try to gain entry into the academy in Vienna again. He's unsuccessful this time. He doesn't even pass the first round of entrance exams. And it's at this point he really starts to harbor somewhat of a negative feeling toward modern art and the art that's being accepted at the time. This is rare for him to paint religious images, but he did, at least as far as 1907, he did paint some religious images because that's known from his entrance exams. But after his failure to gain entry into the Painting Academy in Vienna, he lived on the street for a few years, still painting. The period from 1908 to 1913 isn't very well documented in his biography, but he does enlist in the military in 1914 when World War I begins. So it's right on the eve of World War I that he's painting these pictures of buildings. I just show them for reference because he does have tastes in art, and then the political ideology in the party in the 1930s does have policies toward art. And frequently it's said that he's a failed artist, and that's absolutely true because he was rejected 2 times to the Academy in Vienna. However, he does have a level of technical competence, especially for architectural drawing and detail, that should be noted. That he was competent at painting and drawing, but he just wasn't proficient enough to be accepted into the academy. And he also wasn't painting things that were stylistically in line with what the direction art was going in, which was the more abstracted forms in the years preceding World War I. World War I is 1914 to 1918, and I show this just because it's the point of reference for everything that we're going to be talking about, and it does seem to shape and affect many of the artists that we see and the art that's being produced at this time. For example, George Grosz is another expressionistic artist who, in 1917, in the middle of World War I, paints his experiences. This is a hypothetical explosion of a city, but here you see the same dynamism, the diagonals, the vivid use of color, but this time it has a much more aggressive and haunting and even violent overtone than the forms did before World War I. At the same time, at the end of World War I, in Germany, there is a new emerging movement called Neue Sachlichkeit or New Objectivity. And it's very much a reaction against abstraction and expressionism. And it's much more of a return to order, return to recognizable forms. This painting is called The Night by Max Beckmann, who was drafted into World War I and struggled with his mental health during and after the war as a result of trauma. And he founded the movement Neue Sachlichkeit that was the return to order. It was recognizable forms, a new realism, but at the same time, there's a violence that's incorporated into this new realism. You see people being hung, bones being twisted unnaturally, a woman being bound, another man here who seems to be breaking in. But while it's realistic and um, has recognizable forms, it still has this flattening that's characteristic of the art at this time, that there was intentional flattening of the space and bringing the images to the forefront of the composition. After World War I, what is known as the Weimar Republic is the period in Germany from 1919 to 1933. And it's a period of experimentation with art. There's many options now. There's the abstraction from the expressionists, but then there's also the new objectivity. So there are many different visual trends that people can pick from and be influenced by. I should mention the Bauhaus movement was a school of architecture and art that emerged in Weimar, Germany in 1919, right after World War I. And this is an image oops, excuse me, Bauhaus Guide. And Bauhaus was founded by an artist named, or an architect, excuse me, named Walter Gropius. And this image here was painted by Lionel Feinig, who was an artist that would, Feiniger, excuse me, that would be labeled as degenerate later on. But he still had these expressionist forms that he used. Bauhaus was known for its flat architecture. So in many ways, it was the blending of the form and the function with the reality of many of the new objectivity movements, but then also the abstraction and the dynamism from the expressionist movements. Also at this time, expressionist cinema is another form of new media that's heavily influenced by expressionistic painting. One of the most famous films is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, and it uses the dramatic use of light and shade. Even the movie sets were intentionally created with these diagonal lines, sharp contrasts in light and shade, aggressive diagonals, and then they intentionally built the sets to have this flattening appearance to bring all of the sets to the front of the picture plane. They actually built architecture that was tilted up to bring an expressionist painting to life through cinema. Um, Horror is also an emerging genre at this time. Nosferatu is a movie from 1922 that's also an expressionist cinema. It has the same diagonals, high contrast in light and shade, but then also a sense of horror and dread and a foreboding that seems to be common in the experience after World War I. Another film from 1920 that combines the strangeness, the abstracted forms, but then also a Jewish folktale is The Golem from 1920. And the poster even looks like an expressionistic painting where there's this movement, these diagonals, the contrast of the purple and the yellow, and then these wavy lines and the flattened forms to all create a sense of strangeness, of foreignness, and then a little bit of unease too. Otto Dix was an artist associated with the new objectivity movement, like Max Beckmann. After World War I, he sought to represent realistic images, but in an abstracted way. This is War Cripples from 1920, and it represents a lot of the disabled veterans that would have been visible all over Germany after World War One. This is Otto Dix's The Krieg from 1924, and it shows a stylized but hyper-realistic experience of what trench warfare was like in his experience. This this appeal to the veteran experience is something that was politically unsettling. This image of war that wasn't particularly heroic, that was frightening, was something that was later seen as potentially threatening to to the German public and to German wellness. This image is also called The War. It's from 1923. It's an image that was later destroyed, unfortunately, but here you can really see this hyper realism here, where in this you actually have the light and the shade, and he gives a sense of depth, and then also forms that are realistic but unsettling at the same time. And it's at this time that this image, in particular in Otto Dix, was seen as politically threatening. It started being after Hitler was elected in 1933. He really took issue with a lot of the different movements in German art. And he wanted to show the images, but he also wanted to show them as an example of the problems in German art, the sickness, and the attitudes toward war that needed to be changed, in his opinion. Um, Starting in 1935, he started using the term degenerate to explain um, what these forms represented to him. And in many ways, he was seeing some of these forms as a symptom or symptomatic of somehow the health and wellness of a society. So it's in beginning in 1933, but going into 1935, where there are little exhibits where this art has been taken from artists, taken from museums, and taken up to show as an example of what's negative in society. 1932, this is a poster appealing to veterans. So there's a lot of mixed messages and contradictions, because at the same time, he wanted to appeal to veterans and the veteran experience, but was uncomfortable with artistic representations of war and the experience of veterans that were too realistic, in his opinion. In 1933, Goebbels, after Hitler's elected, Hitler's propaganda ministry breaks down the a Reich's culture plan. So the Reich's Minister for Public Education, for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda is commissioned and empowered to combine the members of professional groups in his area of responsibility and corporations under public law. So these were the members, and then these chambers were established all under Goebbels, who was the Reich's propaganda minister. So you have the Chamber of Visual Art, of Theater, of Literature, of Press, of Broadcasting, Film, and Music. And they're all under they're all under the propaganda minister Goebbels. And the Reich Chamber for Visual Art was number one. It was the first. I mentioned before the Bauhaus movement, and they had structured their school around this division of materials. And in many ways, it seemed that the Bauhaus model for materials was taken and reappropriated for government purposes um, in in the context of Nazi Germany. So in many ways, as much as they rejected the Bauhaus movement closed in 1933 when Hitler came to power. This is a poster of a Bauhaus art exhibit from Weimar in 1923, so 10 years earlier. Um, Here we just have, this is the English just to show you. And it closed in 1933, but in so many ways, it was forced to close. The structure was taken from this to apply to the chamber of culture. And in 1933, the word degenerate started to be used, and like the Otto Dix show, there was the term degenerate started to be used in 1933, but it wasn't really publicized until 1935 and 1936. This is a poster of a smaller Degenerate Art poster from 1936. At this time, in 1933, um, any artists that were determined degenerate, they had been fired from their jobs. Their art could be confiscated by the government. And it was displayed in these shows that were called degenerate art shows. So the word for degenerate in German is Entartete, which comes from a book called Entartung, which means degeneration, which was written by Max Nordau in 1892. And this book is really not about art at all. It's about biological species and species changing over time and degenerate in the sense that forms become unrecognizable with certain genetic conditions or with certain breeding practices. But this book, which was written in 1892 by Max Nordau, was taken in 1928 by Paul Schulze-Naumburg, and it was applied to art. And he wrote this book in 1928 that really builds the case that art is in some way a diagnostic tool um, to diagnose the health and wellness of the individual, of the artist, of the mental state of the artist, but also to diagnose the health and wellness of a society. Um, so this book takes the abstracted forms and compares them to people with physical congenital disabilities, but then also people who have been injured. So it's very much pseudoscientific, but it builds the connection between taking a theory that was made for biology and then applying it to the visual art and coming up with a pseudoscientific approach to evaluate art. This is another page from Art and Race. This book was also reprinted in the guidebook for the Degenerate Art exhibit to give people a guide to try to make that connection between health and wellness and art, and try to make the case that in some ways expressionist art or abstracted art was equivalent to people with disabilities. This is also the time in the 1930s when there's actively propaganda to encourage people to see people with disabilities as a societal problem, as a burden. The Sterilization Act for disabled people in 1933 was written into law. So it was just this mounting cultural persecution of people with disabilities and the propaganda that was being distributed to try to teach people that somehow disabilities were a threat to overall society, and that somehow modern art, abstracted art in particular, was symptomatic of these potential threatening disabilities or illnesses. Um, it's in 1937 that the Great German Art Exhibition is um, is opened in July on July 18th, 1937. It was a show that was 4 years in the making. It took place at the new building, the House of German Art in Munich. This building was built between 1933 and 1937, and it was meant to, and artists were invited from all over Germany to compete, to have their art entered into, to be displayed. But it was all new art at this time. So no existing art, no expressionistic art. It was all new. The show opened July 19th, 1937, to much fanfare. It was publicized. Only about 600 pieces of art were shown in the exhibit by about 100 artists. But there was already some confusion when it opened because the guidelines weren't particularly clear. Um, Ziegler, excuse me, Adolf Ziegler worked with Hitler to curate the show. He would be elected president of art and culture in Germany in 1936. He was also a painter. Um, for example, this is one of the paintings that was included in the Great German Art Exhibition to display new German art. So this is the Four Elements. And the preferred style of this show was neoclassicism, but also realism. So on the surface, it seems classical. It seems to recall something that might be Greek or Roman, but it's not. It's only on a superficial level. It's all neo-realist and neoclassical forms. And it had paintings and sculptures. It had all these new bronze sculptures that were cast. It was visited by about 600,000 people. Um, and art was the point was to sell the art. And it showed about 12,000 exhibits over the course of its run. So it displayed 884 pieces by 100 artists. One of the artists that was featured was Arno Becker. Excuse me. He was close friends with Adolf Hitler and Hitler's architect, Albert Speer. They visited Paris in 1940 and took this photograph. Speer is um, on Hitler's left, and Arno Becker is on the right. This is an example of one of Becker's statue, one of his bronze statues that was included in the show. And it was new. It was created in 1937 specifically for the show. It's influenced by the classical style. This is a still from the movie Olympia that was shot by Leni Riefenstahl. And although the movie came out in 1938, the movie was actually filmed in 1936 when Berlin hosted the Olympics in 1936. This is a work of actual classical art. It's from 450 BC, and it's the Discobolus by Myron. It's an example of classical art that was housed also in Munich at the Glyptotek Museum, and it was pictured with Hitler in 1938. So Hitler did like, at least publicly, he liked Greek and Roman art, in addition to the new neoclassical art that was exhibited at the Great German Art Exhibit. This is another work of actual classical art. It's from classical Greece from 440 BC. That's when the original was from. This is a later Roman copy that was housed in Munich of real Greek art. And it was the inspiration for a lot of the art that was shown in the Great German Art Exhibit in Munich. This is a relief, a cast bronze relief, also by Arno Becker, and it's called Comrades from 1940. And again, is the neoclassical style. In addition to figures from the ancient classical world, Arno Becker also created a portrait of Albert Speer in 1940. And those are two themes that we really see at the Great German Art Exhibition. We see portraiture of current political leaders. This painting in the beginning was the word is obviously a reference to scripture, but it's just a political portrait without any visual references to anything from the past. It's entirely new. So this exhibit opened on July 18th, 1937. And one day after this exhibit opened in Germany, the Degenerate Art exhibition opened in Germany, not far away. And it was intentionally created this way. Although the other exhibit, the Great German Art Exhibit, had been 4 years in the making, the Degenerate Art Exhibit was really the result of all of the confiscation of art from all over Germany, in addition to art from some other countries too. But it was meant to be the contrast to the Great German Art Exhibit. It opened in Munich in July 1937 and was immediately much more popular than the Great German Art Exhibition. Adolf Ziegler, he gave a speech at the opening. He curated a lot of the show. It took place in the Archaeological Institute in Munich. And in many ways, it was meant to be the example of what not to do. It was meant to be the negative art. It was meant to contrast the great German art. But at the same time, it was more popular, it sold more tickets, and it was ultimately seen by over 2 million, where the other show had only been seen by about 600,000 people. This show was open from July 1937 until November 1937. And then it toured Germany in 12 other cities after closing in Munich in November 1937. It was very crowded because they didn't have a lot of time to put it together. They had over 650 pieces in the exhibit. So it was actually more pieces than in the Great German Art Exhibit. And they weren't displayed in any particular order. It was intentionally meant to be chaotic. It didn't have a lot of stylistic themes. It wasn't organized chronologically. Um, Here you have painting and sculpture, you have expressionism, primitivism all put together. Um, and then it had these written quotes on the wall. So this one comes from a publication called Die Aktion. And it says here in German is what it says. It says, they say it themselves. We act as if we were painters, poets, or whatever, but what we are is simply ecstatically imprudent. Um, in our imprudence, we take the world for a ride and train snobs to lick our boots. So it's here that you see all of these quotes that have nothing to do with the art. They're just meant to cause chaos, make it confusing, make it look messy. But at the same time, people responded very positively to this art because this is the art that was showing at MoMA at the time, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was showing in London. These were some of the most famous artists in the world. Here in the middle, this is a image called Masks by Emil Nolde, who was one of the artists who worked with Kirchner, the Brücke artist. Here you see this attention to the mask, to the foreign. It's flat. It's this exaggerated use of color. And these images were very popular. People liked it. They bought the catalogs. This is an image that's now been destroyed by Kandinsky, called Two Sorts of Red. Unfortunately, only a black and white photograph exists, so you can't see the red. Um, but it was meant to display a negative image. But at the same time, people were fascinated by it, and it sold a lot of tickets. Um, Oscar Kokoschka was another expressionist artist. This is his Bride of the Wind from 1914, that was also included in the show. Here, forms are abstracted, but still expressionistic. They're recognizable. They're romantic. And a lot of people in German art or in Germany saw this as um, very German. They saw that expressionism was in some way a national pride and not necessarily something that was negative. Um, Here is this room that says in German, take Dada seriously. And then it shows these works that are not necessarily Dadaism. This is a painting from Kandinsky that it shows. And Kandinsky was an expressionist. He was not a Dadaist. Dadaism was a form of an early form of surrealism that was more popular in France, and was about absurdism. But it's interesting that they took the term and then wrote it over Kandinsky's Black Spot, despite his work not being a work of Dada art. Here is Hitler and Ziegler in that same exhibition, with the Kandinsky image on the wall. George Groats his metropolis was also included with this same dynamism. He made the explosion painting from earlier in World War I, the same year that he painted this with his, which is also an expressionistic exploding street scene with diagonals, the use of words, um, a foreground and a background that's all compressed and comes to the front to flatten the picture plane, but really communicates the dynamism of a busy street scene in an expressionistic manner. Um, there's a statue by Lambruch, by Wilhelm Lambruch. He was a famous German sculptor who was nationally loved and then was declared degenerate and fired, and his work was confiscated. But people still seem to be fascinated by this work. Um, This is another gallery. It shows the Lambruch statue from just another angle. And here you can see on the wall several recognizable forms that we've seen before. There's the blue horses by Franz Marc that we'll talk about in a little bit. We saw before. But these pictures here I wanted to talk about for a minute. They're by an artist named Lovis Corinth, and he's a little bit older. He actually died in 1925, so he died. He was an older generation of an artist. And he painted this scene of Christ being led to the crucifixion called Ecce Homo. Here you can see that picture in the scene with the lady in the dress looking at that. And it's interesting because this art, there's nothing that he does that's particularly abstract. He's very traditional in his forms. Um, but then here he has an image that looks a lot more like a wood block in some of his later art. It's more abstracted from 1919. But they're all themes that come from scripture. He also painted classical themes. This is a Trojan horse from 1924. And it's just interesting that in the Degenerate Art Show, they still include art that's um, from traditional forms, as much as they said that they were restoring order, going back to tradition. That's not what was going on, because the neoclassical forms in the Great German Art Exhibition don't really have a lot of actual connection to classical mythology or to scripture. Even though the forms are abstracted slightly, so many of the forms in so many of the scenes and the images from the Degenerate Art Show were actually much more traditional than the works in the Great German Art Exhibit. Here's that scene again. Here you see Franz Marc's Tower of the Blue Horses from 1913. So thematically, things are just organized very chaotically, but and it was very tight. It was over 650 pieces of art in just a few rooms. Things were all in the hallway, but people still really liked it. Franz Marc also painted two cats, blue and yellow. This is still a very popular picture if you go online. It's one, I mean, Franz Marc's works still continue to sell. So even at the time, despite being labeled degenerate, they were still very popular with people. As I mentioned before with Lovis Corinth, religious forms were also included in the Degenerate Art Show. This is the crowd looking at Emil Nolda's Life of Christ scene. This is the crucifixion from 1912. And it's expressionistic in that it has the flattening of the forms, the diagonals, the green, the use of the unrealistic color, but it still communicates movement, emotion, and shows recognizable images, tells familiar stories in a new way. Nilda's work was ultimately taken to a warehouse in Berlin, where it was confiscated. Um, I should mention that Nilda's art was very much inspired by Matthias Grunewald, who was a German Renaissance artist. So at the same, as much as Expressionism had been labeled degenerate and in some way a threat to Germany and to German wellness, it was very much traditional style. In many ways, Matthias Grunewald's crucifixion scene has many of the expressionistic qualities that will um, continue in the expressionistic period. It has this use of the greenish color, the exaggerated diagonals, the twisted forms that all come to influence German art later. And many did see that in some ways German art or German expressionism was deeply rooted in traditional German art from the Renaissance. Um, this is Ludwig Giese's crucifix. It was unfortunately destroyed during the process of moving it from the show, but it also references Grunewald's crucifixion scene with the attenuated limbs. And it's sculpture, but it still has, in some ways, almost a flattening of forms. The features are exaggerated, the feet, and communicates emotion and pain and experience in a way that's recognizable, but new at the same time. Um, Max Beckmann, who was one of the new objectivity artists, also had some of his religious passion scenes included. Um, this is Emil Nolde, who painted a scene of the crucifixion from 1926. And um, that's Max Beckmann from 1917. And Max Beckmann of Christ and Sinner from 1917. So these forms were considered degenerate, but one thing to note was that there were many religious images that were included in the Degenerate Art Show, and there were no religious images that were included in the Great German Art Exhibit of the approved art. Max Beckmann, who painted that, he ultimately was forced to flee Germany. And as he was leaving Germany, he painted this triptych, which is shows a calm sea, but then in between these other panels of violence, fear, of bound people. But he also didn't really explain it too. I mean, he called this departure, and he did say that it spoke to his experience of being persecuted in Germany, especially after his service in World War I. And then having to ultimately leave, losing so many of his possessions, and losing his works. He felt like a bound captive. He did manage to make it to London, where many of his works were displayed in a show in 1938. That was a show that was all about German Expressionism and German 20th century art, and it was in 1938, and it was in so many ways the same show as the Degenerate Art Show, but it was one of the most positively reviewed shows in London. So all over the world, German Expressionism was reviewed very positively. Um, it went on to tour Germany in 12 other cities. Here's Goebbels at the Berlin Degenerate Art Show in 1938. This is a poster from the Degenerate Art Show. The whole time they were selling the art too, so they were selling it for profit. That's why the art exhibits changed as it went to from city to city, because it was becoming more and more clear that as much as this art, had been labeled as a threat to the state and had been confiscated, it was still very profitable for Nazi Germany. In 1938, they also make a degenerate music exhibition with more overt racism and anti-Semitism. Here it has a racist caricature of a man playing jazz music, and he's also wearing a Star of David to make that connection between foreign people, between people of other races, and Jewish people, and presenting it as a threat. But at the same time, it was very popular in Germany. As much as it was labeled as bad, people still really liked it at the time. Finally, Kirchner, just to end where we started, Kirchner's Street Berlin from 1913 is one of his most famous works. It was confiscated, and in the 1930s, he was forced to flee Germany to go to Switzerland. Here's again another one of his abstract expressionist forms of a nude combing her hair. Um, And then finally, this is him after he was drafted into World War I. This is a self-portrait as a soldier. Like Max Beckmann, he also had a negative experience in World War I. He had a mental breakdown. And then this art it was a self-portrait, but it was actually even labeled that it was self-portrait with prostitutes. So they changed the name to demonize him and his experience. And he actually ended up shooting himself and killing himself in 1938 in Switzerland, right before, right after the Anschluss in Germany, of the Anschluss and the annexation of Austria, because he really thought that the persecution was coming for him in Switzerland. Also, he lost his life's work. Over 600 of his works had been confiscated, and many of them to this day are still missing. Um, Although thousands of works were confiscated, 20,000 works were confiscated, only about 650 of them were displayed. So most of them were stored in Berlin in the Schloss Schönhausen, where they waited to be auctioned off. And finally, I would just like to acknowledge that out of the 112 to 120 degenerate artists, only 6 of them were Jewish. So I just wanted to acknowledge them briefly. They weren't really kept separated from any of the other art. They were put into works or into rooms with some of the other religious art. Um, and then just little comments were written that were leading to their anti-Semitism or acknowledging that they were Jewish. So this is The Cat Breeder by Yankel Adler from 1925. Yankel Adler did survive the war, but unfortunately none of his family did. And Marc Chagall is very famous. He went on to survive, go to New York, and go back to France after the war. But this is a painting called A Pinch of Snuff or Rabbi from 1912. And it was one of the very few works of art that was displayed by a Jewish artist. And it was meant to be negative, but the reception was very positive because even at the time, Marc Chagall was a loved and celebrated artist, and people were just happy to see his work. And then another image of his that had been included was Purim, or Village Scene from 1912. And his forms are expressionistic, but they have a realism to them. They have a dynamism to them, but that same characteristic flattening of the forms, um, and the flattening of space to bring the background to the foreground, and make the experience simultaneously visible to the viewer all at once. And then also capture the emotion and the dynamism of life in his village. He was one of the few Soviet artists actually included in the show. This is him in 1977. He survived the war. And then finally, this is a work by Otto Freundlich, who is one of the Jewish artists featured. And this is a sculpture of a head that he made in 1912 and ended up being the cover of the Degenerate Art exhibition promotional poster. Um, and sadly, he ended up being deported and ultimately killed in Majdanek. So he was one of the few artists, one of the few Jewish artists in the show, but the only one that was actually killed in the Holocaust, despite this connection being made between primitive art, abstract art, and Jewishness. It was hard to make that case when they had so few works of Jewish artists in the show. And then finally, just to show you where you can find this art now, the Victoria and Albert Museum has digitized the entire inventory. So the list has over 16,000 works from the Degenerate Art exhibit. They were itemized carefully, listed by artist. This is Lionel Feiniger here. That's a list of his work, and it shows you how much they paid for it. And then today you can go look for its whereabouts, but still a lot of the art is missing. Um, so I'm sorry I went over time, but that's just an overview of the degenerate art and putting it in context with the larger art trends in the early 20th century. And if you're interested, you can go to the website and look through the inventory yourself.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Lauren. This was great. I loved all the artwork you included in the pictures, and I know this is something we could talk about for forever, because there's just so much to talk about. So we do have a few minutes for Q&A, and if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. It's down at the bottom of your screen, sort of on the right side. But to kick us off, I had a question that I was thinking about as you continued to discuss how, the Degenerate Art exhibit was supposed to be sort of a what not to do with German art, and yet it was so popular with so many people. And I was wondering, for the people who came to the exhibit, and received it generally pretty well, were these people who were otherwise supportive of the Nazi regime and receptive to Nazi propaganda, or were these people who might be more sort of rebellious anyway? Because I'm interested in sort of the reaction in the exhibit, but then also what these people were like sort of in the world beyond that during the Nazi regime.
Yeah, from what I can tell, it was an absolute mix. I mean, there were some people that were just, they thought this was terrible, that this art had been confiscated and they by their favorite artist and they loved it. But at the same time, they still wanted the opportunity to see it because it was so many things packed into one. But then there were contradictions. Like, for example, the artist Emil Nolde, he was actually a member of the National Socialist Party. Eventually, they confiscated his art, but I mean, he actually believed it. And there were some people, because there were so many inherent contradictions. I think that's what it really showed was they didn't have the clearest guidelines for what the approved art was. And then they had even less clear guidelines for what the disapproved art was. So the Degenerate Art Show ended up being a lot more eclectic. So almost there was something for everyone in it. Like there were
Mhm.
the more traditional forms from Lovis Corinth. There were the more abstracted forms from Vasily Kandinsky. And it was just like everything all at once. Um, and it was just organized so compactly that I think people could really interpret it how they wanted to. But there were reports of people from both sides, people that were appalled, but then people that also still thought, well, maybe this is for the greater good.
Mhm. It is interesting how boring the Great German Art Show is, sort of in contrast. And I thought it was really interesting when you were showing the different images, how, there was this clear push with the Great German Art Show to show very idealized forms, nobody who could look even slightly disabled. You wanted this very beautiful, very strong German look that's just so narrow and so boring versus with these other artistic movements, the variety of humanity that's represented. That is really, I think, compelling for people, even if they otherwise bought into the propaganda of the Nazi regime.
Right.
Yeah. So another question that I was really curious about, and you mentioned a little bit about the confiscation of art, but I was wondering, what happened with all of this art after the war? Because you hear a lot about, the sort of struggle to reunite art that was taken from people or from museums, to sort of get that all put back where it belonged. So I'm interested with the degenerate art specifically, like how did it survive the war and what was the sort of process of going through that afterwards?
I mean, the search continues for some of it. A lot of it was sold in an auction in 1939. I think about 4,500 pieces were sold. A lot of it went into private collections. Some of it's still in private collections. Some of it was donated back. There was about 20,000 works that were confiscated as degenerate art, but all total, the Allies determined that about 250,000 pieces of art had been taken all total
Mhm.
by the Nazis. And Hitler had spent, I think it was I know the equivalent now is $65 million just on his private art collection.
Wow.
Um, and even some of the forms were more impressionistic or abstracted. They were, so I mean, it's like there were contradictions. Some of it went into private collections. Some of it went to other museums. A lot of it went to London. Some of it, is in those museums there. Some of it was sent back. Like Emil Nolde, for example, has his own museum in Germany, and a lot of the private collectors donated that art back to try to put his collection back together. But some of it's still missing. And it shows up here or there on the art market. So some of it they said was destroyed, but it
Mhm.
may or may not have been destroyed. It might be in somebody's living room right now.
Yeah, so we might hear a news article about a new piece that pops up, occasionally. That's so interesting. Well, we're at time, so I will just briefly wrap us up by letting everyone know that our next installment of What History Teaches will take place on Wednesday, April 15th at noon Central Time. And in this session, Dr. Kathy Lester-Mansfield, who is a professor of law, will speak about Nazi laws, and the Nazi Party's rise to power in Germany. And she will investigate the legislative means by which the party and its leader, Adolf Hitler, took the country from the democratic Weimar Republic to the dictatorship it became. And she will talk about anti-Jewish laws and specifically the Nazi court system. So all sorts of really interesting things in relationship to the laws the Nazis used to really erode democracy. So please do register for that. And for this session, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this program. So please share it with friends and family members, rewatch it. There are tons of wonderful images in here that you could go through probably several times. That recording will be posted on our website as well. So thank you so much for doing this, Lauren. I had a fabulous time. I learned a lot. I hope everybody else learned a lot as well. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you at our next program. Have a great afternoon, everyone.